Rick is the co-director of the Center for Jubilee Practice. And I'm going to drop that. Someone's going to drop that. Here we go. This is the link to Rick's work. The Center for Jubilee Practice is an organization dedicated to supporting communities of faith as they explore and implement concrete actions of healing, repair, and reparations with Native American and African American communities or with the land itself. Rick is a lifelong Presbyterian who has worked on the US-Mexico border in support of migrants and refugees, and as the co-director of a conference center and member of an intentional community dedicated to multi-faith work around hospitality, justice, and anti-racism concerns. He lives with his wife, Kitty, on traditionally Abenaki territory in the Meskwaki River watershed in North Vermont, and he will tell me if I said that river name wrong. And Rick is a co-journeyer in what this looks like and has been so generous of spirit with the Nuns and Nuns Collective in its early days, the land justice work as it has continued. He is as warm as he is wise, and we are so glad to have him here today. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you, Brittany, and thanks to all of you. It's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. And I just need a moment of personal privilege as I begin to say that though I am a lifelong Presbyterian, I count my radicalization into activism as a faith-based activist, largely as the result of the impact of sisters in a number of different traditions who shaped and formed me, particularly in the 1980s and early 1990s in my work in and around Central America and Mexico with Central American refugees. So Franciscans and Dominicans and Maryknollers and perhaps the most important for me were a small band of sisters based in Mexico called the Misioneras de la Eucaristía, the Missionaries of the Eucharist, who were remarkable partners to me for the 20 years that I lived and worked on the US-Mexico border. So I'm so grateful to be with all of you this afternoon for this kind of conversation in particular. The way we pronounce it, Brittany, is that I am actually on traditional Abenaki lands in northern Vermont in a watershed that is part of the Missisquoi River that flows north into the northern part of Lake Champlain. And those two characterizations are critically important to me as I learn to be a good steward, a good citizen of the earth here in this part of the world. I want to say a word about what the call is that I feel, and I feel it's a great thing to try and do to build on the base that Sister Sharon has offered us. It's fascinating to watch, Sharon, as you create and articulate a new cosmology for many of us. And I'm grateful for that, and grateful for the fact that it's so deeply grounded in your experience and practice at Jubilee Farm, which is where I think any real cosmology needs to be grounded, right? We are the result of the impact that the earth has on us, the land has on us. But I want to say a word about my increasing discomfort as someone who is identified as Christian all my life. Over the last really 8 to 10 years, I have become less and less comfortable with that designation, Christian. I find myself lying awake in bed many, many nights, wondering whether it's possible for us to do anything to reverse the remarkable legacy of harm that has been created in the name of Christianity. It's not harm that I'm going to repeat for us. I know that you've actually been talking about a lot of that harm over the last few weeks together, as you've begun this conversation. But I'll say to you that I live that question in my life in very real ways. And so for me, I've come to believe that really the only appropriate activities for those of us, particularly who call ourselves Christian in the United States or in the first world today, another piece of the language, the dominant culture world, if you will, the only real work that seems appropriate to me is the work of healing and repair and reparations, offering concrete acts of repair to try to mitigate and respond to and build up communities that we have damaged and harmed historically. So, you know, it's obvious that those communities, it's obvious now, I think, to all of us on this call, that those communities are Native American in our context here in the United States, Native and Indigenous peoples, wherever they may be. It's African Americans in the United States who are living with the unbelievable harm that is generational and will be felt for many generations to come of the legacy of slavery, followed by Jim Crow and the policing of Black and brown bodies in our country. And it's also the harm that we've caused through a Christian theology of dominion over the land that has caused much of the crisis that we confront today, an existential threat to all of our communities. And the recognition that some of us are willing to take head on as Christians, that we must be doing something to try and respond to that existential threat that we ourselves have created, seems critically important to me. I've gone so far to suggest in Presbyterian circles that really the only appropriate form of Christian missions today is the work of healing and repair, the work that we must be doing to try and make amends. So having said that, the work that Brittany mentioned in my intro with the Center for Jubilee Practice is really dedicated to helping Christian communities try and take up that work of practice. And I'm so pleased that Sharon and I both have found that word in our lives to be so meaningful, the word Jubilee, and to refer back to the Hebrew scriptures and the practice that it appears God wanted us to integrate fully into our practice of our faith, of recognizing that there's a level at which inequity is a progression that is inexorable and that we really cannot stop, but that we are called to pause in important moments and to reconsider and release debt, release captives, and practice a sense of care for all of those around us and for all that sustains us. So I want to tell you a specific story about that kind of repair work that's very personal to me. I was deeply involved in it. I lived for 12 years in the lower Hudson Valley in a small town called Stony Point, New York, right across the river from an area where I know some of you have a lot of history in Peekskill and Croton. I saw some folks here from Croton. And in Stony Point, we were located on traditionally Delaware Lenape and in particular Ramapough Lenape lands. And our little community, multi-faith community of Christians, Jews, and Muslims living at the conference center began to reach out and try to make relationships happen in the community with the Ramapough. And it was an important time to do so because the Ramapough were in some significant crisis with the community that has now become that part of northern New Jersey and southern New York that kind of lives on their traditional lands, was really attacking the Ramapough people. And so we began just showing up in public spaces to be supportive of them, in court, in the town halls and meetings that were taking place. And eventually we were invited into their ceremonies, tobacco ceremonies, and invited into their own practice, their own cosmology. And little by little, we began to build relationships over a period of years. And then the church where I was a member, a Presbyterian church called Stony Point Presbyterian Church, eventually, at one point, it had been 200, 250 members. And like so many of our churches, it had slowly dwindled down to about the last 15 or 20 people. And this is now just a few years ago, 3-4 years ago. The congregation made a hard decision to dissolve the congregation and lay its work down. In the Presbyterian system, the property is owned by the local presbytery, the equivalent of a diocese for us. And the presbytery then makes a decision about what should happen to the property. And typically what happens is those properties are sold, often to the highest bidder, and the money is invested in other projects, other faith communities within the bounds of the presbytery. In this instance, I asked for permission from the committee that was tasked with decisions about this particular property, if they might be interested in a conversation with the Ramapough. And they expressed some willingness to do that. And so on their behalf, I brokered a conversation. I'll never forget the first day I went and met with Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapough at the local diner, the Mount Ivy Diner. And we were having a meal together, and I explained to him that I didn't have any idea if we could make good on this commitment, but that my hope was that we might broker some kind of a gift of the property, a return of the property to the Ramapough. And I asked Chief Perry at that meal, I said, Chief Perry, this property is beautiful. It's an old brick and stone building that's quite beautiful, but it's not easy to maintain. And, if it were such a fabulous resource, we'd probably be trying to figure out how to hold on to it ourselves. Are you sure that you really do you even have any interest in taking over a property like this? And I'll never forget what he said. His answer was quick, and it stopped me up short. He said, Rick, we are a people systematically dispossessed of our land, and there is no gift of land that we will say no to. And so we began a journey together that took almost 2 years to bring to fruition, of educating folks within the presbytery and crafting together a plan for what might happen to the property if it were to be returned to the Ramapough. Eventually, we hit on a strategy of creating a new nonprofit organization called the Sweetwater Cultural Center. There's a very simple website under that name if you're interested in seeing a picture of the property. And we agreed that the Sweetwater Cultural Center would be formed in the immediate aftermath of a positive decision by the presbytery to gift the property. And so, sure enough, we had a meeting in April of, must have been 2019, I believe, at which the presbytery, in typical Presbyterian fashion, held an open debate with people speaking for and against the proposal, 90 seconds each, for and against. The debate lasted for an hour and a half. Chief Perry was given 2 sessions, that is to say, 3 minutes instead of a minute and a half to speak to the proposal. And I was deeply moved because people that I didn't know in our presbytery, others who I assumed I thought I knew, but who I really didn't, came to the microphone and said things that really shocked me. One Presbyterian pastor said, I grew up in Oklahoma, a few miles from a Presbyterian mission school to the Indians, and I am increasingly aware of what that legacy really means to us and just how much damage we did. And I have wondered for many, many years how I might make amends. And I will be voting in favor of this proposal because of my commitment to do so. One woman came to the mic that afternoon and said, I've wondered for years what I might do to be less ashamed of my own faith when I talk with my children. And I will be voting in favor of this because when I spoke with them about this proposal, they were blown away and couldn't wait to see what might happen because of it. So at the end of the day, it was not a unanimous decision, but it was a 2/3 majority vote, which was plenty in the Presbyterian system of polity. And we filed papers the following week to incorporate the Sweetwater Cultural Center, and eventually applied for a 501c3 status. And 6 months after the vote, there was a ceremony that was held where the title to the property was turned over to the Sweetwater Cultural Center. And I remain active on that board, which by its bylaws is required to have a majority of Native American or Indigenous people on the board of directors. And it's a slow project, particularly during a pandemic. There's a wonderful picture of that day. Thank you. It's a slow project to try and build the Sweetwater Cultural Center. But that's Chief Perry, and his vision is that this is becoming the first Native people's mission or embassy to the United Nations, because the property is located just 45 miles north of New York City. And his dream is that as Native peoples come to speak for their rights and defend their own rights at the UN, and they are potentially overwhelmed by the experience of Manhattan, that the Sweetwater Cultural Center will provide hospitality to them and a safe place for practice of ceremony and for deep deliberation together about how to protect their work together in front of the United Nations. So, it's one little tiny piece of a story that is becoming a mosaic of communities across the country. And it was inspiring enough to me to decide to give my life's work over to this effort and to help create the Center for Jubilee Practice to help other faith communities go through a period of equal deliberation and discernment and prayer and try and determine how we might do this work together. And I'll just finish with this. I really believe that Sister Sharon has it right. We're talking here about the power of the land and the legacy of community. And the most powerful legacy I can think of for our communities of faith is to explore concrete ways in which those who have experienced the most harm can help us to determine what it looks like to repair damage that we've done to the land itself. And so I look forward to being a continuing part of this conversation with all of you. And I'm so deeply grateful to all of you who have been pulling this conversation together for the invitation to be with you this afternoon.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you for generously sharing your story now, and also, you know, for those who haven't checked out our Imagining Land Justice series, the story of Sweetwater Cultural Center in Stony Point is highlighted in the Land Back session, or the Land Back guidebook. It kind of touches on all of the themes, but so that's a place where you can read more. Thank you so much, Rick. There's a lot of love for you in the chat, so please drop your gratitude in the chat, and just so grateful. Maybe as just a quick, I'm putting you on the spot here, but this picture, just like, how did that day feel to you? I mean, here you are. This is the actual ceremony of prayer and transfer of the deed.
Yeah, that's a wonderful photo. I'm so glad you all put it up. You know, the folks who were gathered around that was a communion table at the in the front of, it actually wasn't Stony Point Presbyterian Church. It's another church in the Presbytery, because we couldn't all gather. We needed to gather in a more central location, but it was leadership from the Presbytery. It included several members of the administrative commission that had been formed to determine what might happen with the land and the title to the property itself. And these folks had really become a part of this journey. And if I could just finish with this very brief little vignette. You know, at first, there was one person pictured around that table is a good friend of mine named Rob, who was the chair of the committee. And when I first went to Rob and asked if they would be open, he said, well, why don't you just have a conversation with the Chief Perry and then let us know if he's interested. And I immediately responded, I'm not going to be that guy, Rob. I am done participating in efforts where white people who don't actually represent significant power make promises that they can't fulfill. So if you want me to go on behalf of the administrative commission and pursue this conversation and help to put you directly in conversation with Chief Perry, I am happy to do it. But I am not interested in pretending that somehow my interest in this conversation means something without your backing. And I think that's an important lesson, actually, for all of us. Rob understood immediately what I was talking about. And then I went, because we had a full unanimous vote of that committee, and I went on their behalf to open that conversation.
Brittany, you are muted.
Thank you, Sarah. I just said, I think I said, wow. And yeah, thanks for that vignette, Rick. Thanks for your story, bringing up this picture one more time. And thanks for being with us.